once you get going on a poem, you do become absolutely obsessed with it. You think about it all the time, and you think, I've got that wrong. I think it's as much knowing what you've got wrong as getting things right.
Hello, I'm George Plimpton, and today's guest on Writer's Workshop is a very versatile writer and poet who, besides having achieved considerable stature on his own, had the enormous good fortune to be associated with some of the greatest writers of this century. His name is Stephen Spender, and among other things, he's going to share his personal memories of some of his old friends who happen to have names like T.S. Eliot, Edith Sitwell, and W.H. Auden. Spender talks about some of the problems that today's writers encounter, the absolute freedom, the lack of rules and boundaries in modern poetry. But Spender sees other problems, the fast-paced world we live in, the constant noise, airplanes, television, music, and how we can cope with such things, as we'll hear Spender explain as he talks with William Price Fox and the students on Writer's Workshop.
Who live under the shadow of a war, what can I do that matters? My pen stops and my laughter, dancing, stop or ride to a gap. How often on the powerful crest of pride I am shot with thought that halts the untamed horses of the blood, the grip on good, that moving, whimpering and mating bear tunes to deaf ears, stuffed with the realer passions of the earth beneath this hearth.
Your poem suggested to me that the poets of tomorrow are the people whose backs are against the wall. I've wondered where tomorrow's poets will come from.
Well, I think there's absolutely no reason why any poet should arise anywhere, and apart, I suppose, from the fact that people take creative writing courses and they write poetry as an exercise or something like that. But one can't really explain, I think, why people do have this kind of obsession for writing poetry. James Dickey, I think, was talking about it last week, and I was very impressed by that, because he was talking about something that I feel that once you get going on a poem, you do become absolutely obsessed with it. You think about it all the time, and you think, I've got that wrong. I think it's as much knowing what you've got wrong as getting things right. Well, actually, any kind of writing really is or should be an obsession. I mean, also prose writing. Evelyn Waugh describes how he gets up at 4 o'clock, he will suddenly think of a sentence at 4 o'clock in the morning and get out of bed and write it down, and that he's never satisfied and is always shifting sentences and words in sentences around. I think that writing poetry has to be an obsession of this kind.
And when did the obsession begin for you?
Well, I think that I got the idea of poetry into my mind very early on, because during the First World War, when I was about 9 years old, we lived on the east coast of England, which was bombed rather frequently by Zeppelins, and so we were taken to the west of England, which happened to be the Lake District of Wordsworth and Coleridge and so on, famous for those lake poets. And then my father used to read occasionally these very simple poems of Wordsworth, which are very easy to understand. And I think this gave me the idea of writing poetry and wanting to be a poet, nature poet, really.
Who would you think are some of the more important poets, contemporary poets, say the last 25 or 50 years?
It's always a terrible question. It puts everything, every name out of my head. Well, I suppose
you don't live here, though. You can
Well, do you read? We've talked to a lot of writers that say how important it is, fiction writers mainly, to constantly read, and you can learn almost by osmosis that way. Do you keep up with a lot of the current poetry? Do you read poetry constantly, or do you read fiction, or what?
I'm very glad you used the word osmosis. I only grasped yesterday what it meant, because people are always using it. But wasn't it Mr. Weinberger said that he thought that Russia was going to conquer Poland by osmosis. And I wondered what on earth he meant by this. And then he did explain by a sort of gradual penetration of it from the outside, so it sort of happens automatically. Well, I think one has to read really all the time, but I read, well, let's see, the last few days I've been reading, because I heard them speak, as a matter of fact, near Philadelphia, poems by Dennis Walcott, Trinidadian, who's an extremely good poet. I think he's one of the best poets living. Also by Philip Levine, who rather fascinates me because he writes actually the kind of poetry that we used to think about a lot, members of my generation when we were young, about industry, Ford's factories, Detroit is really his subject, and which he does very well, and I find that very interesting. I'm always reading things and you know, trying to find out, of course, partly how people do things, how they produce certain effects. So, and I think, I mean, it's far more important, really, for a writer to read than, or a young writer particularly, than for him to write, because, after all, it's like knowing a whole vocabulary, because, after all, you think you want to write about certain things. Well, there happen to be dozens of people who've written about any possible subject that you can think of, has been written about already by someone. Although it's been written by someone who is not you see, that's the important thing. So you want to do it slightly differently, but you can obtain a great deal of illumination by realizing that other people have done it already and seeing how they did it. And it's like having a whole vocabulary. In fact, it is having a whole vocabulary accessible to you. There's a very good, I think it always helps to talk about the other arts in a way. There's an extremely good essay by the poet Baudelaire, who is also an art critic, on the painter Constantin Guisse, who was a wonderful draftsman of everyday life, especially rather smart everyday life, people riding on horses and that kind of thing. And Baudelaire explains how Constantin Guisse starts off by doing hundreds and hundreds of drawings of horses, and by knowing how anyone who'd ever painted a horse, how they'd done it. And so that means that he can very rapidly do a new drawing of something which is, or painting of something which is in front of him, because he has these enormous resources, this immense vocabulary in his head of all the horses that have ever been painted or drawn by him or by anyone else. And this is how it is with poetry. I mean that to know a great deal of other poetry is like having command of a whole dictionary, you see, and you have an enormous advantage if you do that. I think it's things students don't realize. I mean, students often, if they're at a creative writing course, you say, would you please read something? And they look at you as though, you know, in the middle of a meal, you were going to ask them to do the washing up or something. They regard reading as a kind of inferior activity which no one who is writing has to indulge in. And that's ridiculous, I think.
I think probably when you started talking about the First World War, the style was changing so much, the new century, and that you had a lot more different forms to experiment with. But today, it seems like for the last 50 years, the form has been the same and has not changed. And sometimes I wonder if you think that's limiting. Do you think poetry is going to change, or it's pretty much set in the direction and the forms that we use now?
Well, I think a great many writers now don't use forms at all. Their poetry is very formless.
That's the kind of form I mean.
That's the kind of form I mean, yes. Well, I think that does tend to be rather dead end. You see, I think that really what happened at the beginning of this century is that poets like Ezra Pound and Eliot, and then a later generation, which was, I suppose, the generation of the 1930s, Auden and McNeice and Day-Lewis and myself and perhaps A.G. Cummings, Wallace Stevens, all these poets, a corresponding generation in America. They found they were trying to write about subjects which didn't seem suitable to poetry. So that they had great difficulty in doing this, because on the one hand, they thought that poetry had to be poetic, about poetic subjects. It had to be in poetic forms. But on the other hand, they wanted to write things which didn't seem really suited to these forms, and which employed a vocabulary which seemed shockingly unpoetic, you see. And it's the struggle, I think, going on in their work between the idea of something very poetic and the compulsion to write about subjects which they think are unpoetic, which gives their poetry such tremendous explosiveness and tension. But I think the trouble is now that as a result of the efforts of Eliot and Pound and all these other writers, is that anyone can write about anything anyhow. And the result is people do write about anything anyhow. I mean, someone writes, I got up in the morning, I went to the John, I ate a bacon and egg, and then I don't know what I did. Then I sat down and started to write the poem. And this poem, there you've got a poem already.
It's a Rod McEwen poem.
You mentioned that you had found that students of creative writing sometimes seem to think it's odd that you think they should read. Well, we hear frequently that people, particularly young people, no matter what they're doing, read less now than they used to. And do you think that's true? And if so, what effect could it have on the future of poetry, both in producing poets and producing readers?
Well, I think it is true. And as a matter of fact, when I think about their busy lives, I wonder when they do have time to read. They're watching television to begin with. Then they're taking pot a little bit, maybe. And then and so that prevents their conversing, because they don't have any conversation either. They just sit around in happy groups without saying anything to each other. I wonder whether they can speak even. But they certainly have given up conversation, which is closely connected, as a matter of fact, with literature. I mean, literature is full of the most delightful conversation. I often go to a party, and no one says anything at the party, except probably perhaps some woman starts screaming at the top of her voice about something.
They can do macrame or something.
Then I go back and I sort of open a novel by Dickens or Jane Austen or something, and I think how absolutely delightful to be with these people who can actually conduct a conversation about something, even if it's about the postal service in 1820 or something. But they can conduct delightful, amusing, witty conversations. But actually one feels rather sorry for them, because I think there is awfully little time to read. There are very few homes where there are books. You see, on the whole, I mean, I belong to a very middle-class kind of English tradition of people who had homes where there were books, and there was a lot of reading aloud even. My parents used to read aloud to us. And there wasn't, of course, TV wasn't invented. The radio was only little things on crystal sets. And you didn't hear any music unless you went to a concert. And now, I think that on the one, there aren't any books around. Music you never stop hearing. It's sort of plugged in the whole time. Every kind of music, not just rock, but also classical music, which has been debased and forms background to commercials and so on. I think the thing is, it's not just a matter of reading. It's just a matter of breakdown of concentration about anything. I had a friend who, I keep on wandering from literature, but I think it sort of helps to wander from literature. I had, because the analogy applies, I have a friend who is very interested in rock music and is extremely musical, but never really likes any classical music, Mozart or Beethoven or anything like that, and I occasionally try to persuade him to. And then he said, well, you know, the reason I've suddenly realized why I don't, because I come from a family where we never had TV off at all, not even when we weren't in the house, because the idea of my family was A, that turning off the TV wasted electricity when you turned it on 5 minutes later, B, that it kept out burglars if it was on the whole time. So we had it on absolutely the whole time. Well, the background to cartoons, for instance, was often music by Mozart or Beethoven or something. So therefore, if I hear this music, I think, well, what sort of trash? Because it's just the background of a cartoon. Well, you see, when I was young, you didn't hear a Beethoven symphony unless you went to a concert. And then you were absolutely swept off your feet by hearing this music you'd never heard before in your life. And so I do think it's terribly difficult for people today to concentrate about these things. And also, I don't know where actually do they read? Where do they get away from the TV, the music, the rock, all the noises that are going on, quite apart from the traffic and airplanes and bombs falling and people being shot at in the streets and things. Where do they get away? So I rather admire, I don't despise this at all. I mean, I admire those who make an effort, that's all. I think it's miraculous that there are people who do.
Well, speaking of difficulty with concentration, you said that you had that difficulty when you were in Oxford and that Auden just would simply shut you in a room and tell you to write. Well, what other techniques did you learn to overcome your difficulty in concentrating?
Well, I don't regard myself as a very concentrated person. I mean, I concentrate by just being obsessive. But as a matter of fact, I write extremely slowly and take a very long time. And I think it's partly because I lack concentration. I've known various... I think I know two types of writers, roughly speaking, in my life. One type who never stop writing, but who have great difficulty in writing. Another type who seem to have no difficulty in writing at all, but in fact write very, very little. It's always rather a wonder to me that there are these two types. And I think it is because the second type has a great deal of concentration, so they can just sit down and in an hour or two, Christopher Isherwood, my friend Christopher Isherwood, and never have to rewrite anything because he has a very, very concentrated person. On the other hand, anyhow, when he was young, he didn't seem to write very much, whereas I was writing all the time, but always had to go back over things because I was so easily distracted. So I can sympathize very much with people who are distracted.
What was Auden like during all this? I'm curious about this.
Well, Auden, I think, had great concentration, but above all, Auden was a person who felt that a problem was soluble. Whereas I think most writers and most artists suffer from the feeling that problems are insoluble, and this is torture to them. But Auden, he lived absolutely according to a timetable. I've never known anyone in my life so conscious of time, nor so absolutely programmatic. I mean, I knew him when he was 20, And he really had planned out his whole life as regards his writing career, and he was simply going to write the collected works of W.H. Auden, which he did, and then he dropped dead. And this is true, really. And I mean, they were getting rather the bottom of a curve towards the end, and so he just ran out of steam, as it were, and just dropped dead. Whereas, I mean, everyone else whom I've known, I mean, I've known a lot of writers, of course, and very good, very gifted people. But when they die, you always feel, oh my God, they never got started. When you think of that, if you've known them all your life, and you've known what promise they had, Louis MacNeice, Cecil Day Lewis, Cyril Connolly, and so on. But with Auden, you thought, oh, he did it all. He did everything he set out to do. But he did always have this idea that it was simply a problem of sitting at a table and working at the thing, and it all came out.
Would you talk a little bit about Cyril Connolly and that group that grew up around him and what he did? I'm a big fan of his.
Oh, well, Cyril Connolly, he above all is my example of an immensely gifted writer. But who really did extremely little about his gifts. There again, you see, he could write. There was Cyril. I mean, Cyril could sit down. Cyril Connolly used to write reviews, which were extremely witty, compulsive reading, every week for the Sunday Times, about 1,000 words long, or something like that. Well, he'd write this in a taxi going to the airport. He could do it so easily. Well, how can one understand that a person so gifted, who could do something so easily, should use his gift so little? And he was absolutely lazy to begin with. He was tremendously lazy.
Fat too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was very much a bon vivant. He liked wine, women, everything. Yet that seems rather an evasion, because I'm not even sure whether he was rather snobbish about, always having very good food, and tended to burst into tears if the soup was a bit cold. He burst into tears very, very easily. I once sat next with him at a dinner party. No, I didn't sit next to him, on the contrary. I sat opposite him at a dinner party, and he was sitting next to a woman who bored him, and tears started trickling down his cheeks. And then finally he got up, came over to me, and said, Stephen, I can't bear it for a moment longer. You must sit there. And this is terribly obvious to the lady in question, who happened to be a rather prominent journalist, and wrote a furious article about our disgusting behavior to her, with some justification, I think. So he was. He also. He was a tremendous character, and to some extent, his writing is about his own personality, I think, which was quite a subject for him. But he also imagined all his life that that society owed him a living. Lots of writers imagine that. In fact, it's a sort of endemic condition of most writers I know, that the world owes them a living. There they are, geniuses. Why are they only getting $10 a poem when, I don't know, other people get enormous sums for writing trash, you see? And so I think they've succeeded in imposing this view on the world for themselves, really, so that now they are given grants and things occasionally. And he thought that if he was given a rather large sum of money every year, then he'd be the genius, he'd be free to be the genius that he knew himself to be. And he identified with all sorts of other frustrated writers, like Baudelaire, for instance. But actually, I don't know, he lacked something. He lacked some kind of willpower, some kind of seriousness. I don't know what it was. but he was always extremely witty, extremely amusing man. It may be that it all went into conversation. I think that it's been remarked that people who talk very well don't write very well, because it all goes out daily in making funny remarks.
Was he a friend of Edith Sitwell's too?
Not very much. He was a friend of Edith Sitwell. In a way, I was the ideal, well, I was quite a friend of his. In a way, I was the ideal friend in some respects, because I was an ideal audience. I was always very amused and not very witty. I mean, that's what he liked. So but he had a lot of other friends.
Was she witty at all, Edith Sitwell?
Well, she was fantastically funny. I mean, she could do. Well, she was witty, yes, but I mean, what she really did was she acted in such a way that she could tell you about it afterwards, and she was terribly good. She was tremendously good at making crushing retorts, and I mean, one story I remember about her, which I liked very much. She was giving a reading, and a man in the 5th row started leaving the hall. He probably had very good reason to do so. And so she stopped her reading, dead, you see. There was this unfortunate man, and she allowed him, in dead silence, to get to the end of the row, into the gangway. So she then said, that gentleman has forgotten something. And so the man looked absolutely miserable and started moving all the way back along the road. And then when he got there, she said, I didn't mean your umbrella, I meant your manners. And that was the kind
Jesus.
Has it gotten any easier to write as you've grown older?
No, I think more difficult, because I think one gets more aware. Well, when you're young, you're blessedly unaware of a lot of difficulties which you see as you get older. I think it gets more difficult because it is an incredibly difficult art, and I think that it doesn't at first seem difficult. One becomes accumulatingly aware of the difficulty of making words mean something, of getting words in the right order, and all these things as one goes on, I think.
This is George Plimpton thanking you for participating in our Writers' Workshop. Please join us again next time.